Hello, and thanks for joining me this week. Today we're going to be talking about toxic black mold. And black mold has become a little bit like these celebrities, Kylie Jenner or Taylor Swift. We've all heard about it. We think we know a little bit about it. And today I'm going to be revealing why black mold is so well known in pop culture microbiology and why it is almost talked about in revered tones as the invisible toxic black fungus. So what's the science underpinning all of this? What are the facts? What's the history about Stachybotrys, which is the scientific name for black mold? We're going to be going through that. I'm going to be showing you what black mold looks like under the microscope. We're going to be talking about how it is different to other molds. We're going to be talking about the mycotoxins that Stachybotrys produces, and I'm going to be giving you a little bit of education about it and talking about some of the situations that I find in water damaged buildings where Stachybotrys is a significant component of the water damage event. I'm also going to be reviewing some of the academic literature about black mold and Stachybotrys and discussing what other individuals and groups like the Center for Disease Control have to say about Stachybotrys. So to begin, what is black mold? Well, essentially it is a catch-all term for all of the toxic molds, but most people are referring to Stachybotrys chattarum or Stachybotrys atra, which are the genus and species names for this particular microorganism. And yes, it is black, and on the bottom left hand side you have a screen grab from my microscope showing black mold. However, the color of the mold, when you find this in your water damaged building, is not necessarily a good indicator to tell you whether or not your property is indeed affected with Stachybotrys. You can only tell by looking under the microscope. It is a very common water damage mold. It's not the most common. In fact, Aspergillus and Penicillium and Chaetomium are other more common fungi, but Stachybotrys is definitely found and has a preference for cellulose-rich building materials like timber, wood, wallpaper, and plasterboard. And later on in this live stream, I'm going to be talking about other recycled or green building products that also are a preferred food source for Stachybotrys. So, how does black mold hurt you? Stachybotrys produces these toxins, a mycotoxin called trichothecene. And I'll show you the chemical formula soon, but in a sense that's not that relevant. This particular toxin has been linked as a chemical warfare agent, as has satratoxin, which is another secondary metabolite from this particular fungus. Did you know that the LD50, which is the lethal dose for satratoxin extracted from Stachybotrys or black mold, is 1 milligram per kilogram per weight for these mice? So therefore it is incredibly toxic. There are a whole bunch of other metabolites that can be extracted from this fungus, including cyclosporin, which is a very, very potent immune suppressant, and this preferentially targets lymphocytes, and your lymphocytes are responsible for allowing you to mount an immune response to challenges that your body may be exposed to. So this is what we're talking about. Toxic black mold, or Stachybotrys, produces a whole bunch of toxins, all of which have similar but different chemical structures. Again, the papers from which I am taking these structural formulae from are going to be listed in the show notes underneath the description for this particular live stream. And I urge you, for anyone with interest in further research into Stachybotrys and black mold and water damaged buildings, to go through the references and the hyperlinks to find out on your own time. But what do these chemicals do inside your body? Well, let's not talk about the symptoms, but let's get down to the level of inflammation. And these toxins, like trichothecene toxins, bind to your ribosomes. And your ribosomes are in your cells and responsible for linking together the amino acids to form proteins. So essentially these toxins interfere with protein synthesis. Thought of another way, they interfere with DNA and your ability of your body to repair itself and for your cells to divide. So they're very, very serious toxins. But these trichothecene toxins are not the only risks in water-damaged buildings. Hence why I gave the analogy that although black mold is well known, like a celebrity, there are a whole host of other, in a sense, B singles and other problems in water-damaged buildings, such as cell wall fragments, the bacteria and yeasts that can also colonize water-damaged buildings, the release of endotoxins, the release of micron and submicron sized cell wall debris, and in fact other building element debris in the micron and submicron range. All of these become essentially toxic biological dusts, and these can be inhaled and brought into contact with your mucous membranes or ingested and become quite a significant immune challenge for you. So there are also the microbial volatile organic compounds, or the characteristic mold odor. All of these have an impact on your immune system as well. So although the focus today is on black mold, there are a host of other reasons why water-damaged buildings and the molds that grow there can cause you harm. Now, what does black mold look like under the microscope? We are going to move to that now. Okay. This is what we see when I connect my microscope to the camera. And what you can see here is from a spore trap that I took in a typical water-damaged apartment that I was asked to inspect a couple of weeks ago. I'll just make this clear and I'll start talking about different aspects of these black mold spores. Essentially, these apartments were on the ground floor. The waterproofing was incorrectly installed. There is a significant legal case underfoot at present, and the end result is that these ground floor apartments have taken on unwanted moisture. There have been rising damp-like effects which have breached the building exterior, and mold has grown inside the wall cavity and on the plasterboard facing the inside of the apartment. And I will show you some of the photographs from this apartment afterwards, but I want to focus on what we see down the microscope. And these are these Stachybotrys chartarum spores, and you can see that even on the spore trap, I need to use they have three-dimensionality. That's what I want to focus on. So even though we have captured this from the air, these mold spores need to be considered not as two-dimensional objects or a photo, but they are three-dimensional, and they have size and mass, and these are the reproductive units that allow the Stachybotrys to disseminate itself and colonize new water-damaged areas. And you can see mold mycelium that germinates from these spores and then grows from it. Now, essentially, what causes black mold in the first place? Well, essentially there are 5 events or things which contribute to mold growth. And that is, in this situation, building defects, water leaking, especially through flat roofs, rising damp situations which impact on the integrity of the base of a building, defects in plumbing features and fixings. I've been called to numerous properties where pipes have unexpectedly burst or ruptured, or hoses that were supposed to be new have suddenly burst. This is really serious. It causes millions of dollars of damage. Extreme indoor condensation is the 4th problem. And we also have unexpected and extreme weather events which impact on underlying building defects and problems in buildings whereby moisture gets in. I'm always asked, can black mold kill you? And in order to get to answer that question, I'm going to answer that question in a second. What I want to do is I just want to zoom in on what we were just seeing. This was a spore trap that was taken from this particular wall, and you can see that the not only has the floor carpet been removed and the plasterboard has been cut away to provide an inspection point, but you can see that the companion wall is showing quite extreme levels of visible mold growing on the interior plasterboard, on the base of the window frame, on the skirting board, and there was carpet there and smooth edge in the corner before. All of these interior or indoor building elements were all impacted by water damage and the mold that formed afterwards. And then eventually I can use spore traps and tape lifts and surface contact plates to collect samples to measure the extent of contamination and comment on habitability and scope of works for repair and restoration in some cases back to a normal mold ecology. And so basically this is the location from which those microscope images were taken. But as I said to you, many people ask me, can mold or black mold kill you? And I want to start with where this came from. Back in the early to mid to late 90s, the Center for Disease Control in the United States reported on some examples of infant mortality that was linked to exposure to black mold or Stachybotrys chartarum or atra in these water damaged building interiors. What happened was that the death of these young children, these infants, was blamed on black mold. So the CDC reviewed all the studies. Unfortunately, their conclusion was that the studies were flawed. Their conclusion was that there may be an association between the mold, but they could not give a definitive yes or no regarding the situation, and their conclusion was that further research needs to be done. The good news is that scientists from around the globe have continued to examine Stachybotrys, the toxins that different molds produce, and have increasingly linked this to inflammation. And we'll discuss in a few minutes about the connection between inflammation and cancer. But I want to look at the next, in a sense, disturbing conclusion made by the CDC regarding the evidence. And I see this again and again when various experts are debating the extent to which a building is water damaged and the potential health implications of this. Often the results are attacked as being statistically unstable. I'm not going to say very much more about this point. All of this documentation is available for you to read online, but these are often criticisms of the environmental results, linking a chemical, a toxin, a biological toxin with human exposure, and oftentimes the very clear and obvious connections that do in fact exist that sometimes can be explained away by certain groups. The other criticism made by the CDC was that non-standardized sample collection methods were undertaken by the researchers. And the third point was the burden of proof, that often when these homes were re-examined to determine exactly how wet they weren't that wet on re-examination. And so there was a lack of direct connection between the first response data collection exercise and subsequent data collection exercises. And I wanted to highlight this because these criticisms emerge directly in response to the literature on Stachybotrys, the black mold. And unfortunately, new emerging research with other water damaged molds, these same approaches to avoid potential connection are often brought up. Now, let's move on to the more common question: can black mold make you ill? Well, yes, it definitely can. Stachybotrys has been linked to a range of what are called building-related illnesses, and they fall under the sick building syndrome class. And so exposure to Stachybotrys, we see this in mice research as well as research, clinical case studies of humans, that exposure to Stachybotrys, these black mold spores, elicits rhinitis, runny nose, cough, irritation to the eyes and throats. As you've just seen with the Centre for Disease Control, there is some controversy regarding how serious a threat is. However, I would argue that asthma, rhinitis, cognitive impairment is a very serious health risk, even though the connection between hemorrhage in infants and black molds was not supported. There is definitely causal evidence linking these molds with adverse health. These Stachybotrys mycotoxins are divided into different structural groups. You would remember the chemical formulae that I showed before. All of them, to a greater or lesser extent, show a very strong inflammatory response. And in fact, your nose is the first thing which comes into contact with these unexpected water-damaged environments. And by breathing in these spores or the odors, the volatile organic compounds that they elicit, that can cause a whole series or a cascade of unwanted inflammatory events. Think of the chronic inflammatory response syndrome that we discussed a couple of weeks ago, as well as interference with your visual acuity or your visual system, brought about because of these unwanted health impacts caused by these molds and mycotoxins. So just remember, low dose, big effect. However, water-damaged buildings are not the only way that you can come into contact with black mold. In fact, the World Health Organization has stated that up to 25% of the world's cereals and crops are contaminated with mycotoxins and the unwanted effects from black mold. In fact, there is a massive industry about mycotoxin testing for this in cereal and tradable crops. So there is definitely some risk of us absorbing other black mold toxins from foods that we eat or animals that we might eat that have ingested these cereals. So this is another exposure pathway that should not be dismissed. Now, I want to get on to building materials because different buildings have different propensity to take on water, and there have been some very good studies that have come out in the peer-reviewed literature looking at differences between water damage to building elements that are made from recycled elements. So a classic example of this is bamboo flooring versus hardwood flooring. Obviously, bamboo grows a lot faster than virgin timber, and therefore it is a great example of a recyclable timber. As well, you have composite timber flooring, and again, plasterboard that uses recycled elements within it. Now, if you look up the paper that is in the show notes below this video, you will find that they did a really elegant experiment. And what they did is they got a subset of green building materials and a subset of non-green building materials, and instead of inoculating just one or two well-known fungi onto these substrates, what they did is they collected dust from a building which was considered to contain a normal microflora, and they used that to inoculate these different building materials. So what they did is they were made wet and they added the dust to each one of the recycled or non-green building materials, and they then let them grow for 2 months, and then they looked at which microorganisms or which fungi had colonized or were the dominant colonizers, and what they found was highly alarming. And they found that plasterboard, wet plasterboard made from recycled materials, is overwhelmingly colonized by Stachybotrys. So that should definitely make you think twice about ignoring water damage in your home. Now, I want to briefly mention something about thunderstorm asthma and its implications for public health. Thunderstorm asthma was an event or an extreme weather event which was particular for Melbourne in 2016. And the reason I bring this up, because I've talked to you a little bit about the CDC and their rather negative conclusions regarding the research data and science. And I want to make the point that back in 2016, this extreme weather event stirred up a lot of dust and pollen, but it was recognized that it also stirred up a lot of fungal spores. Now, many people were hospitalized and a few individuals lost their life due to this extreme weather event. And so at the state and federal government level here in Australia, there is now a move towards developing an Australian airborne pollen and spore monitoring network. And the best thing about this is introducing an interim standard and protocol for, in many cases, how to go about doing the data collection, how to interpret it, and how to report it. So hopefully countries like Australia and New Zealand can spearhead the move towards acceptable criteria for collection of information in order to monitor and classify mold spores in the air. That would be a real breakthrough. In any case, the next question that circles back, and something that I'm asked about on the telephone every couple of weeks: does black mold cause cancer? Well, the mycotoxins produced by many fungi, including those from Stachybotrys, are considered as group 3 carcinogens. And a group 3 carcinogen, essentially, the link hasn't been proven that it causes cancer in humans, although there may be very good evidence to show that it is carcinogenic to animal cell lines, or there is animal data showing causation of carcinogenicity. So just remember, it is a group 3 carcinogen. But if you look at the symptomology of exposure to mold, it is an inflammation event. And the oncology literature states very clearly that inflammation is the 7th hallmark of cancer. So anything that creates inflammation in the body has the propensity towards tumor support. And that's all I'll really say on that, because the academic literature and clinical literature can be consulted for further examples of this. So, is black mold dangerous? Well, of course it is. It is somewhat dose dependent, but different people have different responses to this issue. It does, to some extent, depend on your local environment, your immune constitution, and your genetics plays a very big part in how your immune system responds to these challenges. What are some of the more common mold exposure symptoms linked directly to Stachybotrys? And taken from the literature, these include malaise, fatigue, and cognitive impairment. Often, even the scientists state that the presence of Stachybotrys is not proof of toxin presence. However, the real person-specific outcomes can't be denied. And so those individuals exposed to high levels of Stachybotrys often experience chest tightness, respiratory complaint, and a reduction in their white blood cell count. In fact, one of the first academic papers to appear in PubMed discussed the example of 3 women who worked in a horticultural facility, and they were handling recycled flower pots made from paper. And the skin on their fingertips became blistered and their fingers became swollen. And this was written up as a clinical case study from Germany. And some scientists went into the horticultural facility, took spore traps, and found that there were significant differences in the airborne concentration of Stachybotrys spores when the flower pots were and were not being moved. When they were being moved, they were able to measure 7,500 Stachybotrys spores per cubic meter of air. And what does this mean? Well, the generally accepted threshold that appears in the academic literature is around about 1,000 spores per cubic meter. And in this particular study, they reported only on the concentration of Stachybotrys spores. And so, of course, there is a connection between mold and spore exposure and adverse health. New research is even linking mold exposure to autism spectrum disorder, Alzheimer's, and depression. So the whole point is to control moisture in your property. And there are a number of things that you can do to minimize the likelihood of mold and black mold forming in your property. And obviously that is to control the moisture source. Clean up unwanted water. Use your dehumidifier if you have an energy-tight building that is prone to high levels of indoor condensation. Increase ventilation. Use your exhaust fans. Clean any carpets, preferably with a HEPA-fitted vacuum. Consider the use of a HEPA-rated air purifier or air scrubber. This doesn't necessarily perform source removal, but it certainly will reduce the spore load or particulate load inside the building, and of course raise window coverings in the morning if you're in those types of properties that are prone to high condensation. And just be generally vigilant for changes in water utility bills, or don't overlook building maintenance issues that you should attend to. Water tends to affect building properties at the worst possible time, and they quickly lead to colonization of mold and black mold forming inside your home. So the take-home message is keep your home and building as dry as possible. In any case, I've enjoyed talking about Stachybotrys chattarum today. Be aware that it is a very common mold which is spoken about in the public domain, but it is just one of many molds that can cause unwanted health impacts. My name's Dr. Cameron Jones. I'm an environmental microbiologist. If you're at all worried about black mold or toxic mold in your living environment, you may need to consult an expert. If necessary, it's better to be safe than sorry. Bye for now, and I'll talk to you next week.